Good evening. Good evening. Or whatever, afternoon, whatever it is. All right, first off, I want to thank you all for coming out. Again, the goal of our speaker series is to bring in people who are mavens or experts in their fields and allow you all to be exposed to different viewpoints, different ideas, and different thought processes. Our speaker tonight is Dr. SunAh Laybourn. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Memphis, an affiliate faculty member for the Center for Workplace Diversity and Inclusion, and an academic research fellow of the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Maryland in 2018. Her research examines racialization processes and cross-racial interaction. Dr. Laybourn is the co-author of Diversity in Black Greek-Letter Organizations, Breaking the Line. Her work has been published in Social Problems, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Racial and Ethnic Studies, and Asian Pacific American Law Journal, among others. Her next book project, tentatively titled Adoptable Orphan, Deportable Immigrant, The Paradoxes of Exceptionalism under Contract with New York Press, examines immigration, citizenship, and belonging through the case of Korean transnational transracial adoptees and citizenship rights advocacy. In addition to her work in academia, Dr. Laybourn is an advisory council member for the Korean American Adoptee Adopted Family Network and a member of the Global Citizen Collective Board of Directors. You can also hear Dr. Laybourn every Saturday morning on her radio show, Let's Grab Coffee, and that's on WYXR 91.7 FM Memphis, as she catches up with experts from across the country who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. I want to remind you all that I will be outside scanning individuals in, so if you have not signed in, make sure you sign in with me. But I would love for you all to extend a warm Skyhawk welcome to Dr. SunAh Laybourn.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Good evening. I was like, all right, y'all had practice. All right, we're, do it again. All right, so I am so excited to be here this evening with you all, and we're going to talk a little bit from my book, which Anthony told you about, but tonight we're going to talk about, of course, family matters, ? Right? How adoption and deportation define the American family, and of course, we are going to be looking at this through the lens of Korean transnational transracial adoptions, and really thinking about what it tells us about family, about citizenship, and about immigration. All right. Yes. All right. So I want to start here. In 2015, the New York Times Magazine ran this story about Adam Krapser's bizarre deportation odyssey. So Adam was adopted when he was 3 years old from Korea to the United States by a white American family. But in 2015, ICE agents were at his front door serving him deportation paperwork. So he had reapplied for a green card, and the background check was flagged because of a crime that he had previously committed and served time for. Well, the thing was, his adoptive parents had never followed the procedures to naturalize him, to ensure that he had U.S. citizenship. So even though he was legally adopted from Korea to the United States, he wasn't legally a citizen. And so once that green card application was flagged, he set off into deportation proceedings. And in fact, it was in 2016, right around this time actually, that he was deported back to Korea. The first time he had been to the country of his birth since he was adopted some 35 years prior. So I start with Adam's story for a couple of reasons. So the first is that Korean adoption was the first institutionalized, systematic international adoption program to the U.S., and it laid the foundation for international adoption as we know it today. So now it's kind of common to see international adoption, right? Families made through adoption, but that all started with adoptions from Korea. Now, in total, over 125,000 children from Korea have been adopted to the U.S., primarily to white American families, but over 500,000 children have been adopted internationally overall. So that's the first reason I start with his story. But the other reason is because Adam's story brought mainstream attention to something that had been ongoing, which is adoptee deportations. And so, as this New York Times Magazine article indicates, his story was circulated through a wide variety of media. People were outraged at the idea of a child being adopted to the US, growing up here, becoming an adult, starting a family, doing all the things you do when you're an adult, but then being deported just as easily. And so from his case and the media publicity around it, there began activism and organizing around a legislative fix, right? Why were these adopted children never formally naturalized as U.S. citizens? And then what can we do about it? So I start my talk tonight here to kind of frame out where we're headed. This idea of children who are often seen as children in need of rescue, right? So adoptable children, ideas of the welfare of the child, how might we protect these children and care for them? And oftentimes in the case of international adoption, there are these ideas of this better life, right? So these children from these foreign countries will certainly have a better life in the United States. But in the case of Adam and the dozens of other international adoptees who've been deported and the thousands that could potentially face deportation, we see this other framing. They're no longer children, right? They're no longer cute children who we need to take care of or rescue, but instead they're seen as immigrants and then thought of through this lens of criminality. And they get caught into this formal process of family separation, right? Deportation, family separation. And in this case, these adoptees are not seen as, okay, how might we care for them and think of their welfare, right? They're no longer children, so we don't really care as much about their welfare. Instead, the framing changes to the welfare of the nation. What do we need to do to protect the United States? Well, as we think about these questions, right, about how someone goes from being an adoptee to being a deportee and how these ideas of care and family and belonging shift over time, we actually have to go back in time. So we're going to go back to the 1950s. So a lot of the things that are happening today, a lot of the social issues that you see have a history, right? And history often repeats itself. So it's important to know the histories of, in this case, international adoption and why it was so unique. Again, it's pretty common now, but in the beginning, it was very different. So back in the 1950s, there are a couple of ideas that were very popular or beliefs that were very popular in the United States at the time. So first, there was anti-Asian attitudes, right, and anti-Asian immigration policy. So if you can think back, you might know from history class or government and politics that during this time there was anti-Asian immigration legislation, so no Asians were allowed to immigrate to the United States. There was this idea that Asians could never assimilate, that their culture was just too different, that they would change and potentially overtake U.S. culture in a way that was seen as a threat. There was also this idea that Asians were a particular threat to the American family. So if we think about anti-miscegenation laws, that same idea was applied towards Asians. So a lot of these ideas might sound familiar because we apply them to different immigrants today as well. So that was the case in 1950s. Anti-Asian attitudes were rampant. Now, as it relates to adoption, the idea was that adoptive families should look as if they were biological families. So even though adoption was happening domestically, children and parents were matched on race, matched on physical features, matched on temperament and religion, because adoption was seen as something that was shameful, that should be private. And so it's curious then, how could American families be adopting Asian children and also be adopting children that don't look like them, that aren't the same race? So that's what was happening in the 1950s. Now, of course, something else was happening during that time. So there was the Korean War. the United States and its allies were very much invested in fighting communism. So one piece of that was the Korean War. Now, it didn't end as the United States wanted it to, with a clear-cut victory with the United States and its allies, stopping communism from overtaking Korea, but instead it ended with a ceasefire. And that's how we have North and South Korea today. Now, again, like I said, this was very, very unsatisfactory ending for the United States, really embarrassing for the United States as a global leader at the time. And so the U.S. had to do something to kind of save face and reestablish its global prominence. And so one way that the United States did that was through military servicemen that were still in Korea and through the creation of orphanages, right? So again, this idea of rebuilding post the Korean War and also helping children, right? Who doesn't like to help children? So that was what was happening in Korea at the time. But not only that, people back at home could also contribute to this war rebuilding effort. This was a really big deal at the time. Fighting communism, also increasing the United States international standing. And so folks back at home could send money or clothing and sponsor a child, right, an orphan child. And so this was very popularized at the time. Again, the United States is trying to save face in light of this very unclear victory. People at home are very much invested in fighting against communism, and this is one way that they can do that. Now, another way is through adoption more formally. So we see adoption starting in the 1950s, post the Korean War. Military servicemen are coming home with their adopted Korean child. Again, lots of publicity around this. And in fact, in 1955, Harry and Bertha Holt, this farming couple from Oregon, adopt 8 Korean children. Unheard of at the time, right? But they were so moved by seeing a documentary about Korean orphans that they had been donating money, but they really felt they could do more. And in fact, Harry Holt talked about this as this mission from God, that God placed it on his heart to save these children from the East and bring them to the West. Now, as you can imagine, this was also highly popularized. There were also special immigration policies that had to be passed to allow the adoption of 8 children, the immigration of 8 Korean children over to the U.S. And so it was very much known throughout the United States that something's happening with these Korean children. Not only can we help contribute to their welfare and their safety through donations, but we can also potentially adopt a Korean child. So a few things are happening. There's this merging of this idea of Christian aid or Christian humanitarianism, right? So taking care of orphans and widows. So you have that happening. Harry and Bertha Holt framing their adoption through ideas of Christianity and kind of God's mission on their heart. And then you also have this goal or this desire for Americans to fight against communism, and adopting or at least contributing to the welfare of orphans in Korea is one way for them to do that. Now, I mentioned that matching was the common procedure or process for adoption, so matching children and families based on race and a lot of other factors. But post the Korean War, there were also a lot of mixed-race Korean children, so Korean mothers, but fathers that were military servicemen, both U.S. military servicemen, but also from allied forces as well. And so part of the United States kind of mission in this war rebuilding effort was to encourage folks to adopt these mixed-race children. And this also helped contribute to the U.S.'s international standing, seen as a progressive country, right? Far more advanced than Korea, for example. And so you saw these advertisements in popular magazines at the time. So this is from Jet Magazine, a magazine targeting African Americans. And in this headline, you see this plea by the U.S. State Department for African American families to adopt these mixed-race Korean children. Similar advertisements were placed in popular magazines targeting white American families as well, but the U.S. was able to capitalize on Korea's bloodline or focus on bloodline for the nation. So the idea in Korea was that your citizenship was tracked and granted through your father, right, through a patrilineal bloodline. And so since these Korean children didn't have a Korean father, they could never be Korean citizens. But the U.S. could adopt them and show its progressiveness. Of course, progressiveness within certain limits, right? So Korean and black mixed race babies were promoted for black families to adopt, and Korean white mixed race children were promoted for white American families to adopt. But you see the state, the nation, the United States, facilitating the adoption of these children and again popularizing it. So it was very common knowledge that adoption was happening from Korea and that there was a pathway for families to expand their own families through this form of adoption. Just like today, adoption was also popularized through celebrity. So this is a magazine, World News, the International Social Services, and that's Jane Russell, a popular actress at the time, with a Korean orphan. And then the other picture is just a screen grab from a movie called The Battle Hymn, which was a fictionalized account of a real operation that happened, moving about 1,000 Korean orphans from Seoul in Korea to Jeju Island, which is just off the Korean peninsula. And so this is Rock Hudson, very popular actor at the time. And again, so in the national imaginary, in the popular kind of understanding, American citizens were aware that there was an orphan problem in Korea, that there were these war rebuilding efforts, and that there was something that U.S. families could do. Now, on one hand, to bring it back to something I started with, you have these ideas that are circulating in the United States about these waifs of war, as they were called, these children, again, in need of rescue, and this focus on how can we take care of these children? How can we do what Korean people cannot do? How can we kind of come in as American citizens and contribute to the health and well-being of these, foreign children? On the other hand, you have these ideas around the welfare of the nation, thinking about the United States, thinking about values, again, fighting communism, values of humanitarianism, right, the war rebuilding effort, thinking about the U.S.'s international standing, again, thinking about that unsatisfactory ending to the Korean War, and then also thinking about ideas of family and very much upholding racial stratification within family, right, adopting within racial lines to some degree, and also this idea of citizenship, who might be able to be a member of the nation. We know that at the time there were anti-Asian immigration policies, but how does that apply to these children that could be saved? Well, we can think about this contradiction or this question of these children in need of rescue, but also this idea of immigrants or not quite immigrants through the policies that facilitated Korean children's movement to the U.S., right, their immigration to the United States. So because there wasn't any international adoption really happening before this, there weren't adoption laws, so to speak. Instead, these Korean children came in under different refugee acts being very ad hoc, right, and in response usually to some sort of war. So you have this Refugee Act of 1953, and a lot of Korean children were able to immigrate and join their U.S. families, right, through this piece of legislation. And in fact, the demand for Korean children started to increase so much that adoptive families really pressured the government to extend the refugee visas. And this happened for several years. But there were also concerns. So again, thinking about, are these children, are they adoptees, are they immigrants, are they citizens? It was very blurry at the time. And so some of the concerns about these immigrants, as people thought of them, and as they in fact were, right, they were immigrating to the US, concerns around chain migration, backdoor migration, so similar, right, concerns that we hear about immigrants today. Also concerns around, will these Korean children have a negative influence on American citizens, on American culture? So this idea that culture inheres in the person, and that these Korean babies and young toddlers would have a culture that would not be able to assimilate or would not be able to be welcomed into the US. And also this idea that these children would be a drain on resources and a threat to national security. So again, these anti-immigration attitudes repeating itself. You've probably heard similar concerns around immigration today. Well, these concerns were quelled with a few different changes in international adoption, or how it was approached. So one, these international adoptees followed domestic adoption law, meaning that biological ties were severed. So there would be no concern about chain migration, because for the purposes of international adoption, all of their ties to family back in Korea were severed. So they were seen as legally separate from their birth families. There were also age and quota restrictions that were enacted, and also qualifying criteria for adoptive parents to make sure that they would be able to instill the right values, right, these American values into Korean children. So we see a few things happening at this time. Again, thinking about whose needs and whose concerns, and is there overlap or are there contradictions between, in this case, what adoptive parents want, right, which they wanted children, and that's what led to the extension of refugee laws. It also led to some other laws and policies being enacted, which we'll talk about. And then you have the needs and concerns of the nation, which you hear in these anti-immigration concerns, right? So concerns on protecting a national culture, concerns on protecting even ideals of the nation and who or what the nation looks like. And so on one hand, you see similar concerns for both adoptive parents and the nation. So concerns around fighting communism, again, in this time period, concerns around being seen as humanitarian, concerns around family and creating family following racial lines for the most part, or in ways that could kind of be made sense of along the black-white binary. And then to some extent, concerns around citizenship too, as adoptees were seen as immigrants that could pose a threat to the U.S. And so very much these needs and concerns of parents and of the nation are influencing each other. But as I said, adoption from Korea was the first systematic and institutionalized form of adoption that laid the foundation for the international adoption industry as we know it today. And so as you can imagine, it grew well past the 1950s and 1960s, and we see something very unique happening as Korean adoption continues to expand. So one thing is this orphan eligibility clause of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1961. So this predates the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which ended anti-Asian immigration laws, dispelled the quota system that had governed immigration up until this point. But we can see that Korean adoptees were seen as very exceptional. So this 1961 clause said that first, it permanently guaranteed visas for transnational adoptees to enter the United States, right, in anticipation that they're joining their American families. And they weren't treated as immigrants. They were seen as immediate relatives of U.S. citizens. So this meant that they did not have to adhere to, or they fell outside of the scope of immigration quotas. So Korean children are being seen as exceptional and separate from this idea of immigrants that we must still very much restrict. So 1965, we see the end of anti-Asian immigration policies overall through the Immigration and Nationality Act. And then in 1966, we see this idea of the model minority. So you're probably familiar with this term of the model minority, and it was used to characterize both Chinese and Japanese Americans in the US at that time, to talk about how these model minorities were able to overcome a variety of different hardships and racism and exclusion and lift themselves up by their bootstraps. And this was all credited to their values around education, around family, and this was completely different than how Asian immigrants or Asian Americans were characterized before that, right? Remember, I told you Asians were seen as threats, could not be trusted, and people that the United States did not want to immigrate to the U.S. So we see this turn happening in the 1960s, in the middle of the 1960s. And at this time, something else happens. This desire for Korean children vastly expands. So by now, Korean adoption had been happening for over a decade. And in fact, we see Korean adoption continue to increase year over year, peaking in the late 1980s. And so Korean children were seen as easily assimilable into American culture, even though mixed-race Korean children were no longer available for adoption, right? Thinking about that immediate post-war period, now it's, quote-unquote, full-blooded Korean children that are available for adoption. They are seen as fine fits or perfect fits into American families. And what's unique at this point is while previously African American families were encouraged to adopt Korean and Black mixed race children, they're not encouraged to adopt full-blooded Korean children. So if we think about race and racism and race relations during this time, still a very strict black-white binary, and if Korean children could be seen as assimilable to whiteness, then that means that they couldn't be seen as assimilable to blackness. So these Korean children instead were seen as, not white and not Black, but still because of these stereotypes around Asians in America now that shifted to this model minority, they're seen as being okay to adopt transracially into white families. Now, as I mentioned, Korean adoption continues all the way through the late 1980s before it drastically drops off, and we could talk about why that happened if you have questions. But we don't see any type of legislation related to international adoptees until the Child Citizenship Act of 2000. So even though the U.S. signs on to the Hague Convention on the Protection of Children, it actually doesn't get ratified until 2008. So in 2000, something unique happens. We have the Child Citizenship Act. Now, if you think about the timeline of when adoption from Korea was happening and when these large waves of adoptions were occurring, it makes sense that in 2000 or in the late 1990s, as Korean children are getting closer to adulthood, that U.S. parents who've adopted would start to be concerned about, citizenship of their children and what's going to happen. See, there was no formalized process that told adoptive parents like, hey, even though you've legally adopted these children, they're not citizens. So as families were finding out that their children didn't have citizenship, then you saw a lot of organizing by adoptive parents around some sort of legislative fix. So you have the Child Citizenship Act of 2000. I did the thing that I hate when people do is put way too much information on the slide, but the key point is the Child Citizenship Act of 2000 gave automatic U.S. citizenship to international adoptees who were under the age of 18, so still children, at the time that this piece of legislation went into law. And then it also guaranteed that any future international adoptees would have automatic U.S. citizenship as well. But of course, there were thousands of adoptees that were left out of this legislation, right? Adoptees who were already over the age of 18 when this piece of legislation was enacted it was actually enacted in 2001. And so what about these adoptees? They're no longer children, but yet they still don't have citizenship. They've immigrated to the U.S., and now they're here undocumented. And so what happens to these children, right? Well, a few other pieces of legislation are introduced. So in 2009, we have the Foreign Adopted Children Equality Act, or the FACE Act. And this really brings to the forefront this question of, okay, are these adoptees, are they children in need of rescue? Are they immigrants who we should view with some trepidation? This piece of legislation sought to, one, provide retroactive citizenship to adoptees not covered under the previous legislation, but it also wanted to recategorize international adoptees as citizens from birth. So that way they would have all the rights and privileges of quote-unquote natural-born U.S. citizens. And it also wanted to introduce this definition of a non-immigrant as an individual brought to the United States as a child to be adopted as a U.S. citizen. So when we think about who's a citizen and what makes someone a citizen or what creates different classes of people, we see that here through this piece of legislation, trying to reclassify international adoptees as citizens from birth, but also as non-immigrants completely, even though they did in fact immigrate from Korea or a variety of other countries to the United States. That piece of legislation, no surprise, did not pass. We saw another piece of legislation introduced in 2013, very similar, wanting to retroactively apply citizenship or the CCA to adoptees. Also trying to, again, change some of the different policies around international adoption, but in this case, dropping the desire to reclassify adoptees as citizens from birth, and also dropped the charge of trying to reclassify adoptees as non-immigrants. So you see these ideas of citizenship occurring through international adoptees, and some of the arguments for these pieces of legislation really key in on some of the themes that we've talked about so far. So in this quote by Senator Mary Landrieu, who was the person who sponsored these two bills that I just talked about, she says, deportation is not an option for adoptees. It may be an option for illegal immigrants, but not children who have been adopted by American citizens. So here, reframing who adoptees are, right? Adopted by American citizens. So having some sort of connection to citizenship as we know it, and so they should be, international adoptees should be exempt from the deportation process because of their connection to real American citizens. And then also, again, calling upon this idea of Christian duty. Here she says there have been months and months and years where parents who go through all this trouble to do something they really believe God has called them to do, to come home and find out that their own government, which would be our government, is nitpicking this law to prevent them from getting an easy path forward. So this idea of Christian humanitarianism, this idea of being called by God to adopt, here trying to be invoked to get other senators on board with this piece of legislation. So throughout both the history of international adoption and throughout these different pieces of legislation, we see where adoptees and immigrants are framed as very distinct and separate. We see this difference between the welfare of the child and the welfare of the nation, but international adoptees really come at this crossroads where they are subsumed under both ideas of being adoptees in need of rescue, as well as immigrants who should have the proper paperwork in order to remain in this country and to be seen as American citizens. Of course, we know that there are, as I mentioned in the beginning, thousands of adoptees who don't have citizenship, thousands of adoptees like Adam who could be vulnerable to deportation. And most recently, there's been organizing around the Adoptee Citizenship Act, which seeks to grant retroactive citizenship to international adoptees. This work is ongoing. At the bottom, I included the different years that this piece of legislation has been introduced to both the House and the Senate. So starting in 2015 with Adam's case, right, the publicity around his case and the acknowledgement that there are, in fact, thousands of adoptees vulnerable to deportation, all the way up until 2021. This legislation will likely not pass, right, in the next few weeks of this year, so there will probably be additional legislation introduced. But I just want to pull out a couple of quotes by current senators and representatives who have supported this legislation, the Adoptee Citizenship Act. So here, Senator Susan Collins says, individuals who were legally adopted by loving U.S. parents, raised with American values, and are now contributing members of our society should not be denied citizenship due to a technicality in our current law. So again, we see these ideas of trying to reframe adoptees as children and who they are connected to, right? Loving U.S. parents, but also their contributions to the U.S., that they, one, are assimilated into these American values, and two, that they're contributing members of society. Representative Rob Woodall draws upon some of these ideas of worthiness around immigrants when he talks about adoptees lack eligibility for U.S. citizenship despite their legal entry, and also that they have the right to citizenship that they deserve. And he talks about, again, their contributions to the Korean American community. So really keying in on, okay, who are adoptees? Are they worthy immigrants that should be granted U.S. citizenship? Are they members of U.S. families? Do they have the correct morals and values? This is a difficult type of argument when we think, again, about adoptees no longer being children in need of rescue, but instead being seen under the framing of immigrants and criminality. And we see this again with Adam's case. So shortly after his story in the New York Times Magazine, and as he was facing deportation proceedings, there was a lot of organizing both on social media and then on the ground as well to hashtag Keep Adam Home. And so in this flyer that 18 Million and Rising created to try to draw more publicity around Adam's case, you see this picture of him as a toddler. Now we know when he was deported, he was a grown man, married with children of his own, but this picture of him as a child very much conjures ideas of vulnerable children, children who we could save, that we could rescue. And this quote, "I'm capable of more, there is good in me." So still trying to frame him as someone who deserves a second chance, someone who can contribute to the U.S., right? And again, this framing of him as a little kid, right? Someone that you might be able to feel something for versus an adult who you know has broken the law, and that's why he is facing deportation. Well, that's part of the reason why he's facing deportation proceedings. So how does adoption and deportation define the American family? Well, it does so in a few different ways. So we see that international adoption still contributed to or emphasized ideas about race and the family. So thinking about who could adopt what children, and when. We also see that international adoptees are seen as U.S. family members, right? Thinking about some of those previous pieces of legislation. And they're seen through this lens of children in need of rescue, welfare of the child being paramount. But as adoptees become adults, as children typically do become adults, they're seen through this framing of immigrants. And when this happens, they're no longer seen as in needing of state aid or needing of state protection, but instead are subsumed under this framing that is very popularized around immigration and fears of immigrants who cannot contribute to or be part of the national body as we imagine it today. So I'm going to stop there, and if you have questions, I would love to have a conversation with you all. Thank you.
Hey. Oh, sorry. I think you did that well that nobody has any questions. Oh, Dr. Anderson, Lindsay Anderson, has a question.
I just had a quick question because you were talking. Okay, yeah, I'm just loud in general. You were talking about Adam's situation. So does their immigration versus citizen status, was that ever affected if they did, for example, when they grow up, marry American citizens? Was that still a state of limbo they found themselves in?
Yes. So there are specific rules that you have to follow if you're marrying a U.S. citizen in order to get citizenship right through marriage. And so he was already outside of those kind of restrictions. And so that still wasn't a possibility for him. So he's deported. He cannot enter the U.S. for 10 years from that initial deportation date. So he's halfway through kind of that time period, and then he can potentially attempt to re-enter the U.S. under whatever legal guidelines are at that time governing immigration, but that's kind of his only option at this point.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Why is he what? Oh, DACA. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. That is a good question. Let me think about this. Why is he not covered under DACA? You know what? I'm not sure. But I know that he's not. But that is a good question. We see a lot of similarities between adoptees without. Yeah, so DACA, so thinking about deferred action for childhood arrivals. So children who are brought to the United States illegally, I guess, so to speak, and there is deferred action. So they're not actually citizens, but they just have deferred deportation action against them. So DACA is still renewable for every 2 years, but it doesn't provide citizenship. It just provides a way to legally be in status in the United States, and you can work and go to school, but there's no pathway to citizenship there either. Other questions?
All right, well, seeing no other questions, y'all, let's give Dr. Laybourn a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank y'all.
Dr. Laybourn, thank you for coming out on behalf of the Office of Student Life and Multicultural Affairs. We appreciate you. Thank you all for giving up your time, even if it was for credit, to come out. We appreciate you all, and you all have a good night.